Hey there folks, welcome to Spectrum Pulse. We talk about music, movies, art, and culture. And today we're going to be talking about the new album from Lydia Loveless, titled Somewhere Else. So okay, recently on my walk to the karaoke bar downtown that I like to go to, I discovered a new club had opened up en route. But not your typical overpriced downtown Toronto nightclub. No, this was a place that looks, for all intents and purposes, like a country bar. And every time I walk past that bar wearing my cowboy boots and my heavy leather duster, I always have to restrain a smirk at the massive line of people trying to dress country, or at least in a way that attempts to blend it with your standard nightclub attire, because let's be completely fair here. Most of these guys and girls would not be listening to country music if it wasn't for, say, Taylor Swift or the rise of bro country. And I know that more than a few of them likely threw country music under the bus a good 5 or 6 years ago. But you know what? If I'm being embarrassingly honest, I can't help but feel really quite happy at the popular revival among my generation that seems to be happening right now with country music. Because, yeah, sure, a lot of them are only jumping on the bandwagon for Luke Bryan or Florida Georgia Line, but of that generation, there will be an increased number of people who will decide to go deeper and find country music that's beyond the popular trends, maybe in the past, or maybe in the alternative or underground country scenes. And with more media outlets like Rolling Stone and the AV Club, and critics deciding to cover country music, it gives me a lot of real hope that the underserved genre might be finally revitalized in the critical discussion, which can only be good for country music's evolution as a whole. Yet, on that note, as the only country music critic still on YouTube, let's talk a little bit about Lydia Loveless. Her major label debut album, Indestructible Machine, came out in 2011 and immediately attracted some real critical buzz because of Lydia's fusion of classic country and punk rock. And let me stress this, that album is awesome. The best way to describe this album would be a fusion of Hank Williams III's production and acerbic wit, not to mention vulgarity, Danielle Bradbury's gorgeous voice, and Exile to Guyville era Liz Phair's brand of cutting, yet very vulnerable and emotionally poignant feminism. It was raw, unbridled, and distinctly memorable, with sharp lyrics and even sharper delivery. So it was obvious that I was going to be very interested in her follow-up album this year, titled Somewhere Else. How'd it go? Well, unfortunately, it's not quite as good as the Indestructible Machine, but it is still a very good album and it's definitely worth your time. I'm also fully aware that many of the elements that drop Somewhere Else down a few pegs for me won't be the same as for a larger, more mainstream audience, to which I think this album could be more easily pitched. It's in the fine details that leave me feeling a little bit distant towards this record. And if you're not looking for the little nitpicks that I'm going to point out, they're easy enough to overlook and you'll probably enjoy this album a fair bit. So, okay. First, let me stress that many of Lydia Loveless's good elements are still on display here. Her voice, rough and raw, yet clear and strong, is still as great as ever, conveying a ton of emotion and real presence that give her songs a wonderful texture. Her songwriting is sharp and loaded with barbed comments and crushingly real subtext beneath the surface. And the instrumentation still toes the line between that rollicking alternative country and hard-edged punk. But it's in the instrumentation that you'll notice the first big shift. A move towards more neo-traditional 90s country, albeit with harder guitars. Now, this does work for the majority of the tracks. I grew up with 90s country after all, and it's a good sound for her particular brand of vocals. But the production doesn't always help her out as much as it should, mostly because not all of the rough-edged punk distortion or crisp guitar texture makes it through. It does show up on a couple of tracks, but not enough of them. The sound here, it's a lot more rounded and sanded down and favors the steel guitars well, but sometimes the tonal choices clash a little bit with Lydia's delivery, drowning her out a bit in the mix, and I have to admit, speaking as a fan of punk, I do miss the rougher sound. Indeed, this album does remind me a little bit about how some punks with inclinations towards the mainstream gradually soften some of their rougher edges. And unfortunately, this also extends a bit to the lyrics, in that they aren't quite as vulgar and harsh. Now, they're still rougher and more vulgar than your average mainstream country song, but the punk elements here have been eased back, and that unfortunately means the songs don't have the same degree of individual flavor. And while the technical songwriting is still quite strong, it's not quite as effortlessly fluid and memorable as it previously was on the Indestructible Machine, which I did find to be a little bit of a disappointment. Now, granted, that's mostly a factor in the change of the album's theme and lyrical presentation, and it's arguably here where I find myself with the biggest issue with Somewhere Else. See, where The Indestructible Machine framed its starkly feminist undertones and tackled its political issues head on, Somewhere Else frames its undertones in subtext throughout a series about songs about troubled relationships. And look, while I get the change in direction, Lydia is in a very different place than when she wrote her previous album. It comes across as having a lot less unique flavor and another step towards material that the mainstream could more easily swallow, and in my opinion, to its detriment. And yet, Lydia Loveless, she makes this change work in the bigger picture surrounding this album. She might tackle conventional subjects like late night calling an ex and really want to see you, a relationship flame out and wine lips, drunken hookups in Head, tumultuous relationships and Verlaine shot Rameau, and loneliness in the title track, but it's a combination of her powerful delivery and her frank refusal to cut away and spare us the grimy details that lends the songs a lot of power and emotional weight. The deeper subtext of this album is that most of these situations arose simply because of the inevitable passage of time, and there wasn't much that she could do to stop all of it, from failing relationships to the decay of former idols on Chris Isaak, a theme that leaps to the forefront of my absolute favorite track on this album, Everything's Gone, where she returns home after a long time on the road, and how many things that she's cherished and left behind have just vanished away because, hey, time passes. It lends the album a melancholia that really seems beyond Lydia's years, and it's played with such heartfelt honesty that you really do feel for her on the majority of the tracks, and that does lend the album a lot of strength. So look, I'll admit that I have a personal preference for the harder-edged, more punk-inspired songs that Lydia Loveless writes, and thus a move towards country relationship songs in a more of a mid-tempo vein wasn't one that I found all that exhilarating. But that doesn't make Somewhere Else a bad album, just not one that really resonated with me as much as I would have liked. Because there are still great songs on this record, like Head or Everything's Gone or the title track. But the shift that she makes here reminds me a little bit of hip-hop artist Dessa's artistic shift on Parts of Speech, in that there's more reliance on emotional appeal in her delivery over visceral, impactful songwriting, and I'm not the biggest fan of that particular artistic shift. So for me, this album is a 7 out of 10, but I'm definitely going to recommend it, especially if you're looking for punk-inspired alternative country that has an edge and some real balls and power. And if Lydia Loveless is moving towards mainstream acceptance, well, in my opinion, the more people who hear her, the better. So all you should check this album out. You won't regret it. So yeah, thanks a lot for watching. If you'd like to like and subscribe, I'd be more than grateful. If there's any other albums you'd like me to cover in the upcoming weeks and from 2014, or if there's anything else that you want me to do to improve my presentation, I'm more than happy to hear it. So leave a comment and if you want to talk about it. So until then, see you next time.